That it can seem like it's on the increase because we're becoming more aware of it after as a compensation for a real cultural eclipse about it. Most cultures or many cultures are extremely aware of these sort of problems, and some of them even too aware or exaggerate them, like, tribal cultures that would be forever fearful about somebody putting the curse of the evil eye on them, for example, and including some Western cultures and gypsy culture and so forth, where there'd be such fear of this and paranoia about it. It's understood, like one of Jung's most brilliant colleagues, Marie-Louise von Franz, recognized that psychological projection is a physical attack on others, and we're subject to this constantly. Especially good-looking people are subject to it, and in primitive cultures, or more authentic, what are Aboriginal cultures, whatever you want to call them, the projection would be seen as like a missile or an arrow actually penetrating somebody's energetic field. And this isn't such a fantastic idea. If you ask any young woman who's walked down a street and been cruised and felt like the greedy eyes of predatory males, feeling that almost as a violation in itself without tactile contact, that's not just an abstraction, but that's a real felt experience of something that I think is very real. And because we live in a world in which we are exposed to a barrage of strangers, especially if you live in a big city like where I grew up in New York City. But even here in Boulder, which is 110,000 people, most of the people I see on the street are strangers. So when you look at strangers, unlike people you actually know, you're more likely to look at them from a kind of predatory point of view, because you also sort of have to size them up. Like when I was walking around where I grew up in the Bronx, I had to profile people. I had to do a threat assessment of people I was coming across walking down a street. You have nothing else to go on but appearance, and you need to make these distinctions. And so by getting into that kind of mindset, we're also more likely to project stereotypes and other mind parasite-like things onto people, and they to do it to us because of, we're no longer living like hunter-gatherers with the same 45 people that we know in depth and they know us in depth. We're dealing with strangers. And that's why, and there are certain places, by the way, this is another aside, and then I've got another major thing to point out about how we may exaggerate the increase, but there are certain ideal energy parasite venues. So if I were an energy vampire, I would prefer to go to a rave, let's say, than a library or a shopping mall. Because in a rave, I'm going to have like young, mostly sexually active people there. And they're also going to be on ecstasy and on other boundary dissolving things where they're throwing out tons of energy, and they're in a state of boundary dissolution because of the trance-like music plus the drugs or whatever. So I'm in a ideal feeding zone. And so people should be very cautious about entering an environment like a rave. I also, because I go to a lot of festivals and I write about festival culture, you see this a lot at festivals. Where there's a lot of energy present, and therefore that's where parasites go. And so be careful about, say, being on a boundary dissolving substance in such a setting where you don't have the immunological resources to defend yourself from those kind of people. And basically, set good boundaries, just like you need a strong immune system to live in a world in which we're constantly exposed with microbial parasites or have them in us already. You need good immunological system, good boundaries with the various human sorts of predators we're likely to come across. I even explore that in my fantasy writing as well. The last thing you said about there being kind of overarching parasitic forces that would use people in key positions to do things. And I think that could happen on a number of levels of reality. It could be conscious and it could happen unconsciously. Just like microbial parasites like I mentioned, rabies, they're not conscious, but they are able to, in a very intelligent and clever way, get host organisms, much more complex and evolved animals, to do their bidding and fulfill their parasitic agenda. And so psychopathy, for example, is some evolutionary biologists think is an actual subspecies, and psychopaths do look different under functional MRI scans when shown images of emotional content compared to other people, and there seem to be very stable percentage of the population, and to have a genetic component. So if they're identical twins, there's a greater likelihood if one is a psychopath that the other one is, just as there is a genetic component like that with schizophrenia and identical twins. And so psychopaths get themselves into key positions. They are very likely to be leaders of nation states, somebody like a Vladimir Putin, or CEOs. And so they're able to, and you can say, well, are they just, maybe they're fulfilling the universal agenda of their subspecies without there having to be an executive entity like the Gnostic demiurge that oversees that whole process. But I'm not close to that possibility either. Maybe there is a force that assists that. Norman Mailer's last novel is kind of a late masterpiece. It's called something like the House at the End of the Forest or something like that. It's told from the point of view of a subordinate demon that is manipulating Adolf Hitler's grandfather, and then later Adolf Hitler, through dream implantation and through other means, to create Hitler and to create a vast nourishment for the dark forces by all the mayhem that he's going to create. And so I think that's a possibility too. We are also living in a time where the whole metabolism of the species has sped up enormously. And so therefore, there's more to feed off of in general. There are more human beings alive at one time than we've ever had before. So we're a richer feast. If there are entities from other dimensions, the whole planet is glowing brighter as far as the amount of human energy in the form of sexual chi or emotions or whatever that are being outputted. So that may be altering things. And then also, novelty is increasing. And when novelty increases, this is my philosophy, that means the outer edge of light and the outer edge of dark must both intensify. So we may have, more intense forms of darkness, as well as we are having more intense forms of light right now. And overall, the planet is less violent right now than it's probably been for thousands of years, even though it doesn't seem like that based on what the if it bleeds, it leads journalism would have you think. But like America is thought to have the lowest homicide rate right now than in its entire history, and so forth. We have the lowest per capita war death rate in any time in the last few thousand years, it appears, and so forth. But where distorted, what we're being tuned, you talked about being tuned into subtle energies, that more people are tuned into them, and that can seem to bring things on. And it could both bring things on or increase the awareness of things. And an example of this I wrote about in Alex Gray and the Mind Parasites is when my friend Alex Gray had an early acid experience, and he noticed that in the apartment, happened to be the same time when he met his future wife, Allison, that he's still married to, but they were in this loft and were being given acid. And he noticed that, like, as soon as people took it, they were like acting in kind of ugly and animalistic ways. Like everyone was sort of hitting on everybody, and it was very chaotic and dark, he felt. And then he had a vision where he saw entities feeding off of a milky pool of energy that was being created by this party. And he created a masterpiece image, and people can just do a Google image search and see this image called Demons and Deities Drinking from the Milky Pool. So by accessing subtler energies and taking a boundary dissolving substance, and also in another case that Alex described to me in an interview I did with him, where in a psychedelic experience, he felt he was attacked by a specific parasitic entity and became physically ill afterwards. So all of the above, we're becoming more aware, at least some of us, the materialists, just the opposite. But some of us are becoming more aware of things happening on the subtler plane, and therefore we're labeling more things that were just happening, but without our labeling them in the past, and continuing with others. And also by taking boundary dissolving substances and doing things that allow us to increase our profile in the subtle energy realm, we may be opening ourselves up to attacks. But the energy parasite thing, again, is something observed in every culture. And so we should avoid a kind of, some people will get into this sort of paranoid hysteria. You see this with like the reptilian folks and stuff like that,
Definitely.
where there's like this growing menace, and it's like they're, you know, and it's on the rise, and it's trying to take over everything, and they fall into, you know, distorted conspiratist views about it. You know, I can think of an example. I was reading my mom's favorite novelist is a Vermont novelist from like earlier in the 20th century called Dorothy Canfield Fisher, and she writes very wholesome, conventional kind of stories, but very soulful and well done. And in one of them, you know, there's the protagonist who's a, you know, an intelligent man who's like the principal of a small school or something, and he has dinner with a group of people, and there's this particular woman who he dreads her being there. She's just like a lonely middle-aged spinster woman because she always brings the conversation around to herself, and like, you know, and she's basically an energy vampire. But it's a completely conventional scenario, and he's not using any, she's not, Dorothy Canfield, or the character protagonist narrator, is not using terms like energy parasite or energy sample. He has no names for that. It's just that Mrs. Smith is just always such a dreadful, draining person to be around. Now you and I, for example, have a label for that. So if we encountered somebody like that, we would talk about our encounter with a real live energy sapper. So that's another part of why it can seem to be on the increase, is we're just more aware of it.